Welcome, strangers. All right, we are back to Stranger Part 2. I took a little hiatus from this. I've honestly been procrastinating a bit, but Part 2 of The Stranger is very interesting. It's where the book kind of takes a philosophical turn. Where at the beginning of the book, they're kind of setting up, or Camus kind of just setting up the stage for what's to come next. And this is sort of the second part of the book is sort of Merceau unraveling this philosophical epiphany about life and death and facing death and how to face death and how to overcome death and being on death row and being imprisoned and being in the trial and how arbitrary everything in the trial is and et cetera, et cetera. And I think I mentioned this in chapter one, or sorry, part one, but Merceau is often thought of as a very static character, as in he doesn't change throughout the book. There's no growth. But I argue to the contrary that he does change throughout the novel. Uh, and he actually starts off being very much afraid of death. And he's afraid of how other people view him. He's afraid of being judged. But as we move forward into part two, we start to see these insecurities more. We see them unravel, and we see them being overcome finally in the final chapter of the novel. So, as a reminder, uh, I'm throwing the links to the Into the Absurd merch in the description. Feel free to click on those links and check out the merch. We got coffee cups. I think we have a bro tank, bottle opener, and some other thing. So check that out if you're interested in supporting the podcast. And also feel free to go to the website into-the-absurd.com to just hit me up with any commentary you have, any requests, guest requests, any episode requests, book review requests, whatever you want, let me know. But without further ado, oh, and am I sponsored by Monster? No, but I drink a lot of them and I want to be. So anyhow, let's get right into it. Share the screen. Not that one. So the link to this online version of the book will also be in the description. We're in part two. So just kind of, I think the first few pages, I just want to give like I'll give a recap from the last episode. So basically, Merceau is this guy in 1950s, 1960s, basically post-war era France, specifically Algiers. And he's this guy who seemingly doesn't have any emotions. He doesn't have any attachments. He lives totally in the moment. He's basically like this Buddhist monk in a sense, but only like a modern day depressed. It's like if a doomer and a monk met up and became one. This would be Merceau, right? So he shoots this guy basically because the sun gets in his eye and he's aiming at the dude and he's like, fuck. And he just shoots him. And now he's going to be on trial. He gets arrested. He's going to get on trial. And basically, what's going to happen is he's going to get executed. He's going to get charged for execution. And the rest of the novel will be him essentially contemplating this execution and trying to overcome the fear of it and becoming comfortable with it. So that's a spoiler, hardcore spoiler, but not really because this book came out in the 50s and 60s. So let's get right into it. So the first few pages of chapter one, um, he gets arrested and he doesn't see the point of a lawyer. He is asked if he has a lawyer. He doesn't see the point of it. why do you ask? And then he thought his case was pretty simple. He didn't think that he needed a lawyer, right? But of course, the law appoints a lawyer, and he has to have a lawyer by law. But in Rousseau's mind, it doesn't make any sense because he killed the guy. He knows he killed the guy, and he's an honest man, right? So why does he need a lawyer? What would the lawyer do? How would the lawyer defend him if he's guilty? If he knows that he's guilty, if he's admitting to being guilty, what would a lawyer do to help him, right? So on page 65, when he's speaking to his lawyer, he is asked if he felt sad at his mother's funeral, to which we get the following response. Where is it? Okay. I answered that I had pretty much lost the habit of analyzing myself and that it was hard for me to tell him what he wanted to know. I probably did love my man, but that didn't mean anything. At one time or another, all normal people have wished their loved ones were dead. Okay. So he responds in the same way as when Marie asked him if he loved her. It didn't mean anything, right? And I think this is precisely because love, or the concept of which, is just that. It's a concept, at least to Rousseau. And to Rousseau, concepts are things that describe real sensations, feelings, actions. They're merely words that don't paint the whole picture of what they describe. And what does it mean for the stranger to love his mom or love Marie? If Rousseau was given a different life involving a completely different set of people and experiences, perhaps he would love the people in that life just the same as he does his mother or Marie. And moreover, a large theme in this novel is just how fragile life is, how fleeting it is, along with everything that comes with it, like our feelings, like the feeling of anger, the feeling of sadness, the feeling of hunger, thirst. All these things are fleeting. They go away, they fade with time. So our emotions, our situations, our relationships, all these things will inevitably die or change or transform into whatever comes next. Right? And one day we're attending our mother's funeral, and the next we're swimming in the ocean with the woman we love. Right? That's what Rousseau did. After his mom died, the following day he went and he swam the ocean and had fun with Marie. Of course, a week later, he's on trial for killing a man, right? Life changes, things happen that disrupt it. So Camus writes in such a way that we can notice, sometimes subtly and sometimes instantly, just how quickly Rousseau's emotions change throughout any given chapter. Perhaps then, love didn't mean anything because the feeling of love was something that was, again, a feeling, and feelings are only held at the time of the feeling. Rousseau exists mainly in the present moment, only thinking of today and tomorrow. Having lost the habit of analyzing himself, he is incapable of describing how he used to feel in any given moment. So, like, if you ask him, "Oh, how did you feel yesterday?" It's like, I don't know. I wasn't thinking about that, right? He does not hold on to the feeling of love as something that he constantly feels, but rather something he feels in the moment. And we, the audience, know that Rousseau loves his mother and Marie based off his actions and the subtle hints in the book. And while the actions and feelings associated with love are indeed experienced by Rousseau, he does not recall these things love. He does not call them love purely because he doesn't consider love as a permanent state of being. That is, what Rousseau is doing here is merely separating all abstractions from his everyday experience and just being in the moment. Further down this page, we read, "My nature is such." Where is it? My nature is such. Find it. My nature is such. Well, my nature was such that my physical needs often got in the way of my feelings. I wrote down the quote. The day I buried my man, I was very tired and sleepy, so much so that I wasn't really aware of what was going on. What I can say for certain is that I would rather my man hadn't died. But my lawyer didn't seem satisfied. He said, "That's not enough." Okay. A physical need involves fulfilling a desire through an external activity or resource, whereas a feeling, an internal feeling, right? It's simply an internal state. It doesn't have anything to do with the outside world. Physical needs are not abstract as they have real world consequences, but feelings are only abstract. Of course, like anger, you get angry from external things, you get happy from external things, but the feeling itself, just the feeling, not outside of it, it is just a feeling. At the end of the day, it is just a feeling, right? And while Rousseau doesn't say he loves his mother, he says that for certain he wishes she was still alive. That is, he is uncertain of the abstract idea of love, but certain of the tangible desire for his mother to still exist. To add to this point, on page 67, he's asked by the magistrate if he loved his mother, to which he replies, "The same as anyone." Right? The same as anyone. So he feels love just as anyone feels love. But his love is no different than anyone else's once you strip away all the abstract concepts of familial duty from it, right? Because he loves his mother just as much as anyone would love his mother, or just as much as anyone would love their mother, their own mother, right? But he's not going to say that he loves her in some unique, intangible way, right? So, page 67. Okay. So after asking Rousseau why he hesitated between the first and second shot, we get the following exchange between Rousseau and the magistrate on page 68. Let's see. He took out a silver crucifix, which he brandished as he came towards me. And in a completely different, almost cracked voice, he shouted, "Do you know what this is?" I said, "Yes, of course." Speaking very quickly and passionately, he told me that he believed in God, that it was his conviction that no man was so guilty that God would not forgive him. But in order for that to happen, a man must repent, and in so doing become like a child whose heart is open and ready to embrace all. So, again, we return to the concepts of guilt and judgment. Rousseau is constantly sorry for things that are out of his control. And in a sense, he is likewise constantly repenting. Yet at the same time, Rousseau understands the silliness of constantly saying sorry or feeling guilty for things out of his control. To this point, he doesn't understand the magistrate's reasoning. Yet remember, the become like a child whose heart is open and ready to embrace all. Remember that line because that's going to come important on the very last page of the novel, or the second to last page of the novel, when he's about to die. So when you think of that, try to play around with the ideas of God and the ideas of the absurd as you know them, along with how they interact. So just the line, become like a child and open your heart. Think about that and how it ties into concepts of God that you've heard of and concepts of the absurd and how those two can mix and match. So on the following page, the magistrate asked Marceau if he believes in God, to which we read, I said no. He sat down indignantly. He said it was impossible. All men believe in God, even those who turn their backs on him. That was his belief. And if he were to ever doubt it, his life would become meaningless. This is one of the most important lines in the whole novel. The point is this: if you base the meaning of your life on something as fragile as a belief, then your life will become meaningless the moment you lose faith in that belief. Likewise is the case with feelings like love, right? As discussed earlier, Marceau does not love. And I would argue that the love he speaks of and is asked about is more so a belief than it is a feeling. When we say that we love someone, we are not necessarily affirming a feeling of love, but rather a promise and the belief in love. After all, even if we do not currently feel love for another person, we are still capable of believing that we love them. Yet, if we were to base the purpose of our relationship with someone on the belief that we love them, any doubts about this love, any doubts with this belief could end the relationship. So, the belief in love is not a sustainable groundwork for having a long-term committed relationship, because there are going to be times where you're pissed off. There's going to be times where you're not really sure, where you have doubts, right? And if you're basing your whole relationship on the belief that you love someone, then the moment you doubt that belief, your relationship could crumble apart, right? A relationship is about a commitment. It's about a promise, right? So the same goes with if you base the meaning of your life, the purpose of your life on a belief, any sort of belief, even a belief in politics, a belief in Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, whatever, any kind of belief, then the moment you doubt that belief, your life becomes meaningless, or at least it's threatened by meaninglessness. So a belief can be doubted, but a feeling can only be felt. A feeling can't be doubted. You can't doubt a feeling. If alternatively, we accept the inherent meaninglessness of societal constructs like relationships and love, we're able to free ourselves from the bounds of belief and simply enjoy the relationship for what it is. Likewise is the case for life itself. If we accept that there is no inherent meaning to life, we then free ourselves from there being any possible way to take away our life's meaning. In that way, we are free to find meaning in anything. Okay. So the chapter ends, let's see. I can say that. Okay. And I can say that at the end of the 11 months that this investigation lasted, I was almost surprised that I had ever enjoyed anything other than those rare moments when the judge would lead me to the door of his office, slap me on the shoulder, and say to me cordially, "That's all for today. Monsieur Antichrist. I would then be handed back over to the police. Now, this is an obvious nod to Nietzsche's Antichrist, which we can see quite a few parallels in thought. For instance, Nietzsche's quote, "There was only one Christian, and he died on the cross." This exemplifies the concept that ideas and beliefs are fleeting. The only person that truly understood what it meant to be Christian was Jesus Christ himself. Yet such an understanding was likely something that was only felt during rare moments in which Christ had epiphanies or inspiration of some sort, right? Once such ideas were translated onto paper, or even translated into words in the mind, they became something that was abstract. The feeling of an epiphany is something we almost physically feel, whereas the thoughts of this epiphany in the aftermath is not really felt. Is the difference between understanding and knowing, which we discussed in the young podcast I did with Mina over on his channel. Okay, so chapter 2. I'm just going to skip over to page 77. It's kind of where things start to unravel a little bit. I wrote a lot of notes, so I might skip over some of the things that I wrote just so this podcast isn't like 3 hours long. So let's see. Sky's prison. All right. So pages 72 through 77, what I just skipped over. He kind of describes prison as a time in his life that he never wants to talk about. Primarily after Marie stopped writing to him. And he longs to see her, and he says that life without her is dull. And in that sense, Rousseau not only lost his mother, but also the woman he loved. He lost Marie. After that, life simply sucks, right? And that's another reason why I know that Rousseau loves Marie, he loves his mom, because he talks about them. He talks about how he misses them. He talks about his mom's philosophies that she gave him. He talks about these things. He talks about how life was so much better before prison. He's not a static character. He's a person with a lot of emotions. So on page 77, we have the following. At the time, I often thought that if I had to live in the trunk of a dead tree with nothing to do but look up at the sky flowing overhead, little by little, I would have gotten used to it. I would have just waited for birds to fly by or clouds to mingle, just as here I waited to see my lawyer's ties, and just as, in another world, I used to wait patiently until Saturday to hold Marie's body in my arms. Now, as I think back on it, I wasn't in a hollow tree trunk. There were others worse off than me. Anyway, it was one of my man's ideas, and she often repeated it, that after a while you get used to anything. Psychologically, he's speaking of the hedonic treadmill. As humans, we are extremely mentally malleable. Yet, on a philosophical level, he's speaking to something far deeper, right? That is, the stranger's life is no different than anyone else's. His life outside of prison and his life in prison are only different because of what is perceived and how much this is perceived and how it's perceived, right? Other than that, every life is simply an experience of reality over time. That's all it is. We're just experiencing our reality over time. It feels like we're moving our arms, feels like we're closing our eyes and our ears. And yeah, we feel all those things, but those feelings are part of the experience of life itself, right? So in other words, a stranger, in many ways, he believes that we're all the same person sitting in a movie theater, but each of us are watching a different movie. And in fact, several times throughout the novel, Meursault tries to explain that he is, quote unquote, just like everybody else. namely, perhaps a conglomerate of atoms floating aimlessly through space. Rousseau discounts the unique qualities of individual human experiences in favor of the simpler viewpoint that no one person, nobody, is unique in a world where everyone dies. The slate is wiped clean upon your death. After all, if our existence is finite, but our inexistence is infinite, then our existence is basically nothing in the grand scheme of things, right? Yet on another level, Rousseau's philosophy that one can get used to anything gives leeway to the analysis that Rousseau may give more importance to one's mindset than he does to one's experiences. And in a meaningless world, the inner world becomes more valuable than the outer world. And so, in a meaningless world, one can get used to anything precisely because the world holds no weight on how the mind experiences it, right? The world here is meaningless, while the mind has and gives meaning. Okay. So, on pages 78 through 79, we learn how Rousseau keeps himself entertained while he's in prison. So, but basically, he just remembers shit. He like observes his cell and he'll try to just sit down and imagine everything that's in his cell. And then he basically has this realization that if a man were to only live one day, he'd have enough experiences for a whole lifetime. So, in a way, it was an advantage. Again, I think Camus, through Rousseau, is trying to emphasize the relativity of human experience. Any experience, no matter how boring, painful, pleasant, exciting, etc., can be tolerated by anyone. All lives have an infinite number of things in which the mind can remember, imagine, ponder, etc., to keep them occupied for an eternity. Yet all lives likewise lead to death, right? And so, no matter what one's individual experience of life is, it will always be as if such a life never happened, anyways. Okay. So then we have pages 79 through 80. He has this old scrap of newspaper that's under his bed. And on it was a news story. And I'm quoting here. The first part of which was missing, but which must have taken place in Czechoslovakia. A man had left a Czech village to seek his fortune. 25 years later, and now rich, he had returned with a wife and a child. His mother was running a hotel with his sister in the village where he'd been born. In order to surprise them, he left his wife and child at another hotel and gone to see his mother. She didn't recognize him when he walked in. As a joke, he'd had the idea of taking a room. He had shown off his money. During the night, his mother and his sister had beaten him to death with a hammer in order to rob him and had thrown his body in the river. The next morning, his wife had come to the hotel and, without knowing it, gave away the traveler's identity. The mother hanged herself. The sister threw herself down a well. Must have read that story 1,000 times. On the one hand, it wasn't very likely. On the other, it was perfectly natural. Anyway, I thought the traveler pretty much deserved what he got and that you should never play games. Okay. So we learned quite a bit about a psychology in this passage. On the one hand, and notice I'm using the same terminology as he used, we notice that Rousseau is a skeptical person, affirming that the story doesn't seem to have likely happened, right? And on the other, we see his understanding. He's a very understanding person, right? He gets people, he understands them. He understands why people do the things they do, even when no one else can explain it. It's perfectly natural, the behavior of the mother and the sister, right? This guy flashes his money, they're poor, they need money, and this guy was kind of being a douchebag, so they go and they kill him, right? And then they find out that it's her son and her sister, right? So, or her her brother, sorry. Most people are capable of understanding the actions of another. However, if a person's beliefs about the world conflict with another's actions, then we choose not to understand their actions, right? So the stranger notably has no beliefs about the world and can thereby choose to understand anyone for any action. I think the pretty much got what he deserved, or pretty much deserved what he got, is more of an addition to the "it was perfectly natural" line. He deserved it in that it was an inevitable consequence of playing games with his family. I take this point of view because Rousseau, he's an immoralist, right? So thinking of things as deserved or undeserved I don't think that would be really something that he would do, right? Okay. Chapter 3. So on page 83, we have the following. It was then, let me find it on the video. Okay. It was then that I noticed a row of faces in front of me. They were all looking at me. I realized that they were the jury, but I can't say what distinguished one from another. I had just one impression. I was sitting across from a row of seats on a streetcar, and all of these anonymous passengers were looking over the new arrival to see if they could find something funny about him. I knew it was a silly idea since it wasn't anything funny. They were after but a crime. There isn't much difference, though. In any case, that was the idea that came to me. So Rousseau is saying that there isn't much difference between people trying to find something funny about someone and trying to see if they committed a crime. The point is they're looking to judge and uncover what lies within Rousseau. It was entertainment, right? Regardless of such being a comedy or a tragedy. And this immediately reminds me of the 2019 film Joker, which, if you haven't seen it, is essentially a version of the Joker's origin story from Batman. In the film, the Joker says the quote, "I used to think my life was a tragedy, but now I realize it's a comedy." That is, anything, even the most horrific life, can be turned into something comical. One can find humor in anything just as they can find horror in anything. As such, there really was no difference between the jury looking for something funny or looking for a crime in Rousseau. Okay. So later on page 84, I noticed then that everyone was waving and exchanging greetings and talking. So he's standing outside where all um, the the journalists are. All the journalists are there. The media, they're all standing outside and talking, quote, as if they were in a club where people are glad to find themselves among others from the same world. That was how I explained it to myself, the strange impression I had of being odd man out, a kind of intruder. So this part is interesting not because it reinforces that that he's a stranger, which several parts of the book reinforce that, but more so that he felt himself a stranger in a crowd of people that were only there because of him, right? They were all there because of him, because of his trial. But those people didn't care about Marceau, right? They cared about his story. This sort of emphasizes how little Marceau matters in this trial. It's all about his story. Like they don't care that he murdered someone. They could care less that that the guy that he killed is dead. They don't give a shit about that. All they care about is the story for their job, right? Same as the lawyers that are in this trial. They don't care that someone was murdered. They don't give a shit. The his defendant doesn't care about defending Rousseau. All they care about is their job and making the money to go home. Same as the judge, and all the jurors are there because they have to. Right? So Rousseau is not of concern here. The people oppressed don't care about the Arab who died, right? Again, and they don't care about Rousseau, whether he goes to prison or he's free. They just care about the story. Okay. So at one point, a man, one of the reporters, he begins staring at Rousseau, to which we get all he could see in his slightly lopsided face were his two bright eyes. Okay. So Camus includes this part, I think, to show us that Rousseau is aware of his perceived emotionlessness and his hyper-observant nature. The lack of emotion portrayed by this quote unquote watcher makes him a mystery, a stranger. So it was as simple as the writing of this novel, right? Which made it all the more complex. And just like this novel, it was what his face wasn't doing that was interesting to Rousseau, right? So we go to page 86. So on page 86, we are introduced to all the witnesses, who basically turn out to be everyone who was introduced in part one, at least almost everyone. That is the quote, the director and the caretaker from the home, old Thomas Paris, Raymond, Mason, Salamano, and Marie. Okay. So, and they also had Celeste, I think. Yep. So Marie kind of waves to him anxiously. And then Celeste, which was the last to be called, stood up. I recognized next to him the little woman from the restaurant with her jacket and her stiff and determined manner. So it's so interesting because I think in a real trial, that doesn't makes absolutely no sense that a lot of these people are even witnesses, especially the woman who was sitting at the restaurant, because she just saw him doing nothing, right? Uh, her seeing him had absolutely nothing to do with the murder whatsoever. So it's weird that she's even there at all, right? So part of this is the simple dynamics of storytelling, right? And Camus introduce these characters um, because they'd be important for the story. Yet, I think another layer to this is that we as humans are constantly worried not about being judged by strangers, but about being judged by those we know, right? And in the end, all those people in which Marceau interacted with would come back to judge him, right? Would come back to lay testimony to his murder. Okay. So we jump to pages 89 through 90. Okay. So we have the following quote. For the first time in years, I had this stupid urge to cry because I could feel how much all these people hated me. So he obviously is deeply affected by the emotions of other people. He could feel how much they hated him. He could feel it. So he's not a psychopath. I I've heard so many analyses of the stranger calling the stranger a psychopath or a sociopath, but he's not even a little bit. He has so much empathy and understanding for other people that it'd be impossible to call him a psychopath. Like he feels their hatred for him. He feels it. And he wanted to cry because of it. It affected him so much. So we he didn't cry when his mother died, right? But he wanted to cry when he felt that everyone hated him. And why did they hate him, right? He was a stranger. He was someone that they could hate, that they had permission to hate, that they were allowed to hate because he killed someone. So and they're allowed to hate someone that kills someone, right? He was someone that people could hate, right? With this, we are given more proof that Meursault is a dynamic character. He's not a static one. His character matures and grows throughout the novel from being someone who deeply cares about being judged or disliked to someone who believes such things are absurd and meaningless. And at the end of the book, spoiler, we learn that Meursault wishes that he will be greeted by a crowd of people who hate him at his execution. Okay, so move to page 91. When Thomas Preese's turn came, a bailiff had to hold him up and help him get to the witness stand. Preese said it was really my mother he had known, that he had seen me only once on the day of the funeral. He was asked how I acted that day, and he replied, "You understand, I was too sad, but I didn't see anything. My sadness made it impossible to see anything, because for me, it was a very great sadness, and I even fainted, so I wasn't able to see Monsieur." The prosecutor asked him if he had at least seen me cry. Freeze answered no. The prosecutor in turn said, "The gentlemen of the jury will take note." But my lawyer got angry. He asked Paris in what seemed to be an exaggerated tone of voice if he had seen me not cry. Paris said no. The spectators laughed, and my lawyer, rolling up his sleeves, said with finality, "Here we have a perfect reflection of this entire trial. Everything is true and nothing is true." Right? And I almost wonder if Camus put that in there also to say perfect reflection of this book. Everything is true, nothing is true. Right? There's more than meets the eye. Right? So this further adds to the absurdity of the trial. This demonstrates just how ridiculous it is that they're mainly asking questions that have nothing to do with the trial. And of course, the quote unquote trial, I think, is much more of an analogy for the absurdities of human civilization, right? Everything is true and nothing is true precisely because humans, not reality, determine what is and what is not true. And so anything can be true and anything can be untrue depending on who you ask. Take the belief in God, for example. If you ask someone, "Have you ever seen God before?" they will reply, "No, I haven't." But their comeback should be, "Have you ever not seen God before?" Right? The prosecutor asks about what can be seen in Rousseau. Yet, as we know, it is what we can't see of Rousseau that matters, right? Since he is a complete mystery, any assertion about him can be true just as much as it can be untrue. It can be false, right? Okay. So then we go to page 92. So Celeste, the owner of the cafe that Marceau is a regular of, is brought to the stand, and he claims that the way I see it, it's bad luck. Okay? And the way I see it, it's bad luck. Everybody knows what bad luck is. It leaves you defenseless. And there it is. The way I see it, it's bad luck. Okay. So here, Celeste acts as a translator of Marceau's thoughts on the matter, right? It was just bad luck. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had the pistol by chance, right? He had asked Raymond, or yeah, he had asked Raymond to give him the pistol so that way, just in case he was standing back there with the pistol in case something bad happened. And he still had a pistol when he went back outside to basically catch up with his thoughts, right? So His emotions at his mother's funeral and all the things he did prior to the murder had nothing to do with why he committed the murder. He killed the Arab because the sun got in his eye, right? It was bad luck. Yet people always want a reason for things. And I have to recall this time I was like in middle school or something. I was playing Xbox with my cousin online, like Xbox Live. And he was saying something, like asking me if I wanted to do something. And I was like, I don't feel like it. And then he asked me why. And I was like, well, I just don't feel like it. And he's like, why? You have to have a reason why. It's like, I don't know, I just don't feel like it, man. Like, I just didn't feel like it, right? Like, you don't have to have a reason for everything that you do, because the reality is our reason is that we want or not want, right? Those are our reasons, and we make up reasons after that. This is something that Nietzsche talks a lot about, how we make reasons after the fact. After we do an action, we make up a reason. Nietzsche talks about it all the time. I highly recommend reading either Beyond Good and Evil or The Gay Science. Very good books for that. Okay. So we want to there's a step further than that, right? We want to believe that a level-headed person with no criminal history at least has a reason to kill someone, or that it is in fact the case that they were never level-headed to begin with, right? So either you're a smart person and you have a reason to kill someone, or you're not a smart person and you don't have a reason to kill someone because you're dumb and you can't think for yourself, right? So to accept that an intelligent man with free will could kill another person because the sun got in their eye, this just suggests that the average ordinary person doesn't have as much control over their world and their actions as they thought, right? It's frightening to hear something like that. Oh, I killed him by chance, right? Well, that means that any person could kill someone by chance, right? And people don't want to think that way. And moreover, um, this lack of control makes life meaningless. It makes it feel meaningless, right? The understanding that such a lack of control exists just adds to that meaninglessness. There was no reason why Rousseau killed the Arab. And and by the way, I call him the Arab because that's what he's called in the book. Just an Arab man that Rousseau killed, right? The fact that he didn't cry at his mother's funeral, that he wrote that letter for Raymond, that he did anything is entirely irrelevant to the trial. All these things painted as much a picture of who Rousseau was as white paint on a white canvas. Again, everything is true and everything isn't true. Okay. So let's get to page 97. All right. It's the last page in this chapter. So this chapter leaves us off with the trial was adjourned. As I was leaving the courthouse on my way back to the van, I recognized for a brief moment the smell and color of the summer evening. In the darkness of my mobile prison, I could make out, one by one, as if from the depths of my exhaustion, all the familiar sounds of a town I loved and of a certain time of day when I used to feel happy. The cries of the newspaper vendors in the already languid air, the last few birds in the square, the shouts of the sandwich sellers, the screech of the streetcars turning sharply through the upper town, and that hum in the sky before night engulfs the port. All this mapped out for me a route I knew so well before going to prison and which now I traveled blind. Yet it was the hour when, a long time ago, I was perfectly content. What awaited me back then was always a night of easy, dreamless sleep. And yet something had changed since it was back to my cell that I went to wait for the next day, as if familiar paths traced in summer skies could lead as easily to prison as to the sleep of the innocent. Whoa, right? His life outside of prison was good, right? And he was happy. And in prison, he realizes that he could have just as easily been outside of it, right? If the sun had gleamed differently upon him, would he have still shot? If he had said no to writing Raymond that letter, would he have ever gone out to the beach house? Everything that had happened in Marceau's life was a part of a long line of events that were leading up to his imprisonment. To look back upon the past is to recognize the permanency of it, right? To see that there was almost never anything you could have done to change it. It all sort of happened that way. And as a friend used to tell me, quote unquote, life happens, whether you like it or not. Right? And I will say, as a note of that, where, I said there was a chain of events that led up to Marceau being in prison. Um, I want to play the devil's advocate with that, and that I mean, at the end of the day, you do always have a choice, right? Uh, where it was chance, and I just want to say Nietzsche brings up this idea of the myth of causality, right? Where if you kept saying why, right? Why is that? Why is that to everyone's answers, right? Uh, you'll lead back to the origin of the universe, and it's like, well, why is that, right? And then you'll just keep going, right? Turtles all the way down. So if there is never an original cause, then how can there ever be any effects, right? Uh, take that as a side note. It's kind of irrelevant to this book, that concept, but take that as a side note. But for the purposes of this novel, there is causality. We're going to use causality as a philosophical, as something that we can use on a philosophical basis of the novel to understand the meaning behind it, right? So again, life happens, right? Whether you like it or not. Okay. So we're on chapter 4 now, part 2, chapter 4. We're on page 98. Okay. So even in the prisoner's dock, it's always interesting to hear people talk about you. And during the summations by the prosecutor and my lawyer, there was a lot said about me, maybe more about me than about my crime. So, but were their two speeches so different after all? My lawyer raised his arms and pleaded guilty, but with an explanation. The prosecutor waved his hands and proclaimed my guilt, but without an explanation. That is, Marceau's lawyer pleaded guilty, but he explained why it was not maliciously intended, whereas the prosecutor simply explained how guilty Marceau was and how intense such guilt was, right? To the point where Marceau was so guilty that he was an evil man entirely void of morality. And I would have to disagree with Marceau and with Camus here. I understand I understand what they mean, but they both explain it, right? But in a different way, right? They both proclaim that he's guilty, and they explain it, why he's guilty and how he's guilty. But the defendant lawyer, he claims that he's he's guilty, but he did it by accident, basically, right? It was bad luck. The prosecutor says it was premeditated. He's guilty. It was premeditated, and he did it for a reason, right? So this demonstrates the arbitrary nature of language, right? In that both lawyers were trying to frame Rousseau's guilt in a different way. While the bare facts of each story remain the same, they both have the same access to the same evidence. The explanation of the why behind such facts were different, right? They're formulated by the opinions, desires, and goals of the two lawyers. So this same theme returns on page 100, which we're going to come back to this page, I think. Where is it? For there's no ordinary murder, no thoughtless act for which you might find mitigating circumstances. This man, gentlemen, this man is intelligent. You heard him, didn't you? He knows how to answer. He knows the value of words, and no one can say that he acted without realizing what he was doing. Right? And he says, I couldn't understand how an ordinary man's good qualities could become crushing accusations against a guilty man. Now that's a good line. It's a good line, right? So this brings to mind the quote, unquote, Miranda rights that police say when they arrest you. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Yet the reality is it's not just anything you say, right? But rather anything you do, did, don't do, didn't do, say, said, don't say, and didn't say that will be used against you in a court of law. All of you can be used against you in a court of law. Even the quality of intelligence, as Rousseau says, can be used against you. In this case, intelligence applies free will. And the concept of Rousseau being intelligent makes his crime seem even worse. Right? They want him to be an intelligent man who premeditated the murder. If he's intelligent, he premeditated it. That's the logic here. An intelligent man wouldn't just shoot someone because the sun got in their eye. That doesn't make any sense. So, a terrible act done freely and intelligently is worthy, in the eyes of the herd, of being the last act done freely and intelligently of them, right? So, let's go back to page 98. Okay. Rousseau is explaining how it seemed that everything was happening without any of his input. No one cared what the accused had to say for themselves. He counters his own opinion by saying that even if people did care about what he said or what he had to say, right? But on second thought, I didn't have anything to say. Besides, I have to admit that whatever interest you can get people to take in you doesn't last very long. For example, I got bored very quickly with the prosecutor's speech. Only bits and pieces, a gesture or a long but isolated tirade caught my attention or aroused my interest, right? So that is what made all this all the more absurd, is that through these hours upon hours of lawyer speeches, witnesses testifying, and like, most of this wasn't really even listened to or cared about by most people, right? They just kind of heard bits and pieces, they took in what they could, but for the most part, most of what people were talking about, most people didn't listen to, right? So let's go back to page 100. Okay. Okay. So let's see. My mind was always on what was coming next, today or tomorrow. Okay. So he says that because he had never been able to feel remorse for anything. I said that weird. Remorse. He had never been able to feel remorse for anything because he's always in the moment, always on what's coming next, today or tomorrow. So he doesn't feel bad about his actions that he committed in the past. He is always in the moment. Either that or he's thinking about what is next, right? What's in the next 24 hours? What's going to happen? Rousseau lets go of the past, and while everyone else remembered, held on to and dwelled on it, right? So this concept is very Buddhist and Taoist, yet it likewise entails a certain level of self-forgiveness, which is Christian, right? So it's very like, he's a very spiritual guy when you kind of look at him. He's very like, if you've read Siddhartha, if you've read the Tao Te Ching or any of the Dhammapada or learned anything about Buddhism or read Alan Watts or anything like that, you'll see that he's a very like Zen dude if you really read into it. So he's very smart. He is intelligent, and he's just very like he's very Zen. He's very peaceful. So let's go to pages 101 to 102. Okay. So we have the following interesting passage talking about the prosecutor. Okay. But he wasn't afraid to say it. My callousness inspired in him a horror nearly greater than that which he felt at the crime of parricide. So just a little backstory. There was another trial going on that would happen the following day where this boy killed his father. Okay. And also, according to him, a man who is morally guilty of killing his mother severs himself from society in the same way as a man who raises a murderous hand against the father who begat him. In any case, the one man paved the way for the deeds of the other, in a sense foreshadowed and even legitimized them. Okay. So and then he goes on to say, he must be punished accordingly. That you will not think it too bold of me if I suggest that the man who is seated in the dock is also guilty of the murder to be tried in the court tomorrow. He must be punished accordingly. Okay. So the prosecutor suggesting that Merceau leaving his mother in the home was a form of morally killing her, a crime worse than the boy who would be tried for killing his father. In the former case, the perpetrator is indifferent to his mother and simply leaves her without much thought. Right? In the latter case, the boy kills his father, but he doesn't just kill his father, he kills his father with passion, a passion which still holds the roots of love implanted within the boy since he was a child. Right? The boy cares, so he kills the father. Right? Whereas Marceau is different. He just leaves his mom because he doesn't care. Okay. So the prosecutor is trying to make the claim that that's even worse than the boy who killed his father, which, I mean, really, man? Right? Like, what the fuck? All right. So it is not the leaving of Marceau's mother that bothers the prosecutor, it is his lack of emotion toward it, right? Then we go to 102 through 103. So let's see. I stood up, and since I did wish to speak, I said almost at random, in fact, I never intended to kill the Arab. Okay. The judge replied by saying that at least that was an assertion, that until then he hadn't quite grasped the nature of my defense, and that before hearing from my lawyer, he would be happy to have me state precisely the motives for my act. Okay. So, fumbling a little with my words and realizing how ridiculous I sounded, I blurted out that it was because of the sun. People laughed, my lawyer threw up his hands, and immediately after that, he was given the floor. But he stated that it was late and that he would need several hours. He requested that the trial be reconvened in the afternoon. The court granted his motion. So he was never even given a chance to explain himself, right? So after this, everyone laughs, right? And it was true. Merceau killed the man because the sunlight hit his eyes in such a way that something like clicked, right? And he pulled the trigger. But to believe that someone could kill a man because of something as random as a gleaming sunlight, this was horrifying to people, right? So horrifying, in fact, that the crowd chose to treat it as a ridiculous joke and they laughed at him, right? So this relates back to how the jury was both looking for something funny and they were also looking at a crime at the same time, right? There wasn't any separation between the two acts, except one makes you laugh and the other doesn't, right? Yet, all in all, it was a matter of both framing and picking and choosing what to believe, right? So then, as the trial comes to a close, Marceau is struck by a longing for how things used to be. He says, quote, I was assailed by memories of life that wasn't mine, but one in which I'd found the simplest and most lasting joys, the smell of summer, right? The part of the town that I loved, a certain evening sky, Marie's dresses and the way she laughed, the utter pointlessness of whatever I was doing here, seize me by the throat, right? Um, seize me by the throat. And all I wanted was to get it over with and get back to my cell and sleep. So anything that I can't find on the page, on the PDF, I'm not gonna like spend too much time looking for it. I'm just gonna look at my notes if it takes too much time, because some parts I didn't write a page down. And I mean, honestly, most people listen on Spotify then look at the YouTube channel. So sorry, YouTubers. We're going for the Spotifyers. All right. So we see here that Rousseau does, in fact, think of the past, right? He remembers it. He longs for it. But most of all, when looking at the past, he sees just how pointless all of this is, right? Everyone knew he was guilty of murder. So why not just get it over with, right? The countless testimonies, the drawn out speeches, the made up explanations, and the constant absence of any desire whatsoever from Rousseau's opinion all seemed to be a complete waste of time to him. In a sense, the courtroom was itself a punishment for Rousseau's crimes, right? So a couple pages later, his final sentence is announced. He will be executed by a guillotine in the name of the French people. Okay. All right. So that brings us to chapter 5. This is the last chapter in the book. Okay. So it is almost the most existential and it's the most spiritual chapter in the book. It doesn't seem spiritual if you're just reading it, but if you really look into it, it's like a very spiritual, very existential chapter about the meaning of life, about death, about overcoming the fear of death, about being in a trial, about living life, all these things. Okay. So we learn right off the bat that Rousseau's refused to see the chaplain for the third time, and all he is concerned with is escaping the machinery of justice, seeing if there's any way out of the inevitable. Okay. So now from Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus, which I'm not sure if you've read it, we learn that religion is, to Camus, a sort of quote unquote philosophical suicide. Okay. That is, the acceptance and commitment to any one single religion is likewise the suicide of philosophical thought. As such, requires one to be fluid with their beliefs and way of thinking. So, through this lens, Rousseau refuses to see the chaplain because he does not want to give up alternative means of obtaining hope in this seemingly hopeless situation. To Rousseau, surrendering to the chaplain and the Christian faith would be submitting to the hopelessness of the situation. That is, if there is no way out of his cell and back to his normal life, he might as well make sure that there's a way out of hell when the guillotine strikes him. Right? Marcel would rather choose to find a way out of prison and back to life he once held dear than out of a realm which he was not even sure of its existence or not. Right? He wasn't interested. So this desperation is further echoed down the page when he says, what is it? I can't count the times I've wondered if there have ever been any instances of condemned men escaping the relentless machinery, disappearing before the execution, or breaking through the cordon of police. Then I blame myself every time for not having paid enough attention to accounts of executions. Man should always take interest in those things. You never know what might happen. Okay. Now, the word choice of machinery to describe the justice system is both interesting and expected from Camus. Right? The justice system was a machine in that it went on regardless of who existed within it. Right? It was almost its own life force, and this is something echoed by Dr. Christopher Ryan, who wrote Sex at Dawn and Civilized to Death, which I've talked about in the podcast. The justice system is itself an entity, almost like an artificial intelligence of sorts, and it goes on with or without us, right? I mean, obviously, it doesn't go on without everyone, but it goes on with or without you, the individual, right? So everyone who played a role in the justice system did just that, right? They played a role. They were mere cogs in a machine. The justice system didn't care who Rousseau was or what he had to say. All that mattered was getting to the final verdict through a tight, rule-driven, bureaucratic system of exchange. Time and time again, such an exchange would continue, right? Prison or no prison, execution or no execution, this long or that long. Such were the outputs of the machine of justice. Nonetheless, Rousseau feels guilty that he didn't pay enough attention of executions, but mainly because, again, he sought hope. He wanted hope. He wanted hope that there was an escape. Okay. Then we get the following page. Okay. What really counted was a possibility of escape, a leap to freedom, out of the implacable ritual, a wild run for it that would give whatever chance for hope there was. Of course, hope meant being cut down on some street corner as you ran like mad by a random bullet. But when I really thought it through, nothing was going to allow me such a luxury. Everything was against it. I would be caught up in the machinery again. Okay. So he begins to see an inconsistency between the certainty of the verdict and change of events that led up to it right after that. So let's go. The fact that the sentence had been read at 8 o'clock at night and not at 5 o'clock, the fact that it could have been an entirely different one, the fact that it had been decided by men who changed their underwear, the fact that it had been handed down in the name of some vague notion called the French or German or Chinese people, all of it seemed to detract from the seriousness of the decision. I was forced to admit, however, that from the moment it had been passed, its consequences became as real and as serious as the wall against which I pressed the length of my body. So Merceau is pointing out exactly what he means by the machinery of justice here. The justice system was put in place by people who no longer exist, right? And it is continued by an entirely different set of people. Such people are likewise mere mortals who have the same capacity for flaws as Merceau does. They all shit, they all pee, they all change their underwear, right? The bureaucratic nature of it all, though, right? This puts the final nail in the coffin and all detracts from the seriousness of the situation that he killed someone and now he's going to be executed, right? Nonetheless, arbitrary or not, it was very real that he would soon be executed, right? And there was no denying that. And execution is a very serious matter. Hume says on page 110 that if he ever got out, he would watch every single execution he possibly could. Okay. So then we go to page 112. Let's skip there. Okay. You always get exaggerated notions of things you don't know anything about. I was made to see that contrary to what I thought, everything was very simple. The guillotine is on the same level as a man approaching it. He walks up to it as you would walk up to another person. That bothered me too. Okay. So I think what bothers him about this is just how normal the guillotine is. You walk up to it as you're walking up to another person, right? As if you're walking up to any ordinary person or any ordinary object, right? It was just an object. That's all the guillotine was, just an object. But to the imagination, it was more than an object, right? Perhaps for Rousseau, the guillotine should be, well, more than just an object you walk up to, right? There should be more to it, be more serious, but it was kind of this arbitrary thing that just stood out in the street that you walk up to, like walk up to another person. So it seems so melodramatic, so meaningless to him. Yep, this is where we kill people, right? It's so arbitrary, and there wasn't anything special or extraordinary about it. It wasn't much different than a potato peeler or a knife, right? Okay. So the next line I want to share is regarding the conceptualization of Rousseau's death, right? He says, what is it? Let's find it. I would listen. Okay. I would listen to my heartbeat. I couldn't imagine that this sound, which had been with me for so long, could ever stop. I've never really had much of an imagination, but still I would try to picture the exact moment when the beating of my heart would no longer be going on inside my head. But it was no use. The dawn or my appeal would still be there. I would end up telling myself that the most rational thing was not to hold myself back. Okay. Yes. It is in these rare moments when we're laying in bed, staring at the ceiling above us, that we think of the sound of our heartbeat. Right? I do a lot. How it beats and it beats and it beats, seemingly endlessly. But it will one day, right? Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day it will. It will stop, right? And it was difficult to imagine. It's really hard to difficult, or sorry, it's really hard to imagine our hearts stopping because it's always going, right? And we don't want it to stop. And how could this thing that's been going on our whole lives, how could it just stop? Right? That doesn't make any sense. So, sitting there contemplating his death, he would think of the dawn. How, quote unquote, they always come at dawn. And he would wonder, with terror in his heart, when he would hear the footsteps come for him. But when he doesn't hear those footsteps, he states, "My man used to say that you can always find something to be happy about." Man used to say you can always find something to be happy about. Right? In my prison, when the sky turned red, a new day slipped in my cell, I found out that she was right. Because it might just as easily have heard footsteps and my heart could have burst. Right? So even in the most meaningless, hopeless situations, you can always find something to be happy about. His days were numbered, and each new day, it was a smile on his face, right? It's just like what my grandpa says. He's just happy to be alive, right? Rousseau's days were numbered, and each new day, it put a smile on his face. It made him happy. I think here's when Rousseau begins to slowly unravel a unique spiritual epiphany of sorts. One that is not reliant on meditation, on prayers, on books, on years of practice, on religion, God, teachers, shamans, psychedelics, or anything outside his own mind and his own struggle. So I also find it interesting that he has so far quoted his mother 3 times while in prison. Once you explain that, after a while, you could get used to anything, which I shared. And another, which I didn't share, was to tell a story of his father getting sick after watching execution. And then the third time was here to say that you can always find something to be happy about. Okay. So for a man who was judged for not loving his mother enough, he sure did think about what she said a lot, right? Not only that, but he used her words to get through the toughest time in his entire life. In that sense, even though he wasn't there to say it, it seemed as though she was telling him that she loves him, that he is forgiven from the grave, right? And he tells her the same by holding on to those words, right? His mom, he may not be there. Maybe he acted in a way that he shouldn't have. Maybe he should have shown more emotion, but at the end of the day, he does love his mom and he remembers the things that she told him, right? So this death contemplation unfolds deeper on page 114, where he says, "Deep down, I knew perfectly well that it doesn't much matter whether you die at 30 or at 70, since in either case, Other men and women will naturally go on living, and for thousands of years. In fact, nothing could be clearer. Whether it was now or 20 years from now, I would still be the one dying. At that point, what would disturb? Oh yeah, we don't need to talk about that. I would still be the one dying, right? And actually, that's yeah. Sorry. At that point, what would disturb my train of thought was the terrifying leap I would feel my heart take at the idea of having 20 more years of life ahead of me. But I simply had to stifle it by imagining what I'd be thinking in 20 years when it all came down to the same thing, anyways. Since we're all going to die, it's obvious that when and how don't matter. Okay. Yes. When we are confronted with the thought of dying soon, this thought terrifies us, right? You have the reassurance that, oh, I'm young, I probably won't die until I'm like 80 or something, right? That makes us feel better. But the thing is, you can die at any time, right? And whether you die at 25 or you die at 80, you're still the one dying, right? And you'll go through the same exact existential dread regardless. Moreover, Marceau, as a man who lives in the now, understands that it doesn't matter when you die, because in the moment of your death, you will still be the one dying. And when I look at the past, back in my life, it seems that every moment, whether it was when I was 3 years old or just last week, it seems like it's an infinity away from me in time. Why is that? Because in every moment we are constantly changing. The past is gone forever, right? And if it is gone forever, then every moment in the past is equidistant from us. The now is always a new moment in which we are a new person. And at one point, this new person simply doesn't come. You're dead, right? And that's going to be us. So there's then this really long, intense exchange between Rousseau and the chaplain, between pages 115 and 120. And if you don't know what a chaplain is, it's basically a preacher. So this is from pages 115 to 122. But I'm going to skip over pages 115 and up to most of page 119. I highly recommend reading it though, because it's really psychologically interesting exchange. So on page 119, the chaplain exclaims, "No, I refuse to believe you." Let's see, where is it? No, I said, you turned over. Do you really love the earth so much that? And blah, blah, blah. He says, "No, I refuse to believe you. I know that at one time or another you've wished for another life." I said, of course I had. But it didn't mean any more than wishing to be rich, to be able to swim faster, have a more nicely shaped mouth. It was all the same. But he stopped me and wanted to know how I pictured this other life. Then I shouted at him, "One where I could remember this life." And that's when I told him I had enough. Okay. One where I can remember this life is perhaps one of the most life-affirming statements ever written in Western literature. Right? This is the famous yes, right, to Nietzsche's greatest weight thought experiment. Okay. Although he will soon be executed, although he'll never see Marie, although his mother is dead, although hundreds of people hate his guts, although everything in his life has gone to shit, that doesn't matter. None of that matters. He would relive this life, this exact life, again and again and again and again, and would only want to be in another life where he could remember this life. Why? Because it's his life and no one else's, right? And we're taking this from the myth of Sisyphus lens, right? Sisyphus has his boulder, it's his rock, it's his struggle, right? This is Merceau's life and no one else's. And not one goddamn soul on earth could take that away from him. Rousseau would say yes 1,000 times over to the demon from Nietzsche's The Greatest Weight, right? All right, guys. So the last 2.5 pages are just so good. that I'm just going to read them in full. I'm just going to leave you with the last 2 pages, and I'm going to let you analyze them. Right? This podcast has gone on long enough, right? From there, we'll part ways as strangers once again. Okay. So this is basically Rousseau's grand epiphany. Okay. So where is it? Yes, my son, he said, putting his hand on my shoulder. I am on your side, but you have no way of knowing it, because your heart is blind. I shall pray for you. Then, I don't know why, but something inside me snapped. I started yelling at the top of my lungs, and I insulted him and told him not to waste his prayers on me. I grabbed him by the collar of his cassock. I was pouring out on him everything that was in my heart, cries of anger and cries of joy. He seemed so certain about everything, didn't he? And yet none of his certainties was worth one hair of a woman's head. He wasn't even sure if he was alive because he was living like a dead man. Whereas it looked as if I was the one who'd come up empty-handed. But I was sure about me, about everything, surer than he could ever be, sure of my life and sure of the death I had waiting for me. Yes, that was all I had, but at least I had as much of a hold on it as it had on me. I had been right. I was still right. I was always right. I'd lived my life one way and I could just as well lived it another. I had done this and I hadn't done that. I hadn't done this thing, but I had done another. And so it was as if I had waited all this time for this moment and for the first light of this dawn to be vindicated. Nothing mattered. And I knew why. So did he. Throughout the whole absurd life I'd lived, a dark wind had been rising toward me from somewhere deep in my future, across years that were still to come. And as it passed, this wind leveled whatever was offered to me at the time, in years no more real than the ones I was living. What did other people's deaths or a mother's love matter to me? What did his God or the lives people choose or the fate they think they elect matter to me when we're all elected by the same fate? Me and billions of privileged people like him who also call themselves my brothers. Couldn't he see? Couldn't he see that? Everybody was privileged. There were only privileged people. The others would all be condemned one day, and he would be condemned too. What would it matter if he were accused of murder and then executed because he didn't cry at his mother's funeral? Salamano's dog was worth just as much as his wife. The little robot woman was just as guilty as the Parisian woman Mason married, or as Marie, who had wanted me to marry her. What did it matter that Raymond was as much my friend as Celeste, who was worth a lot more than him? What did it matter that Marie now offered her lips to a new Rousseau? Couldn't he, couldn't this condemned man see, and that from somewhere deep in my future, all the shouting had me grasping for air, but they were already tearing the chaplain from my grip, and the guards were threatening me. He calmed them, though, and looked at me for a moment without saying anything. His eyes were full of tears. Then he turned and disappeared. With him gone, I was able to calm down again. I was exhausted and threw myself on my bunk. I must have fallen asleep because I woke up with the stars in my face. Sounds of the countryside were drifting in. Smells of night, earth, and salt air were cooling my temples. The wondrous peace of that sleeping summer flowed through me like a tide. Then, in the dark hour before dawn, sirens blasted. They were announcing departures for a world that now and forever meant nothing to me. For the first time in a long time, I thought of a man. I felt as if I understood why at the end of her life she had taken a fiancé, why she had played at beginning again. Even there, in that home where lives were fading out, evening was a kind of wistful respite. So close to death, the man must have felt free then and ready to live it all again. Nobody had the right to cry over her, and I felt ready to live it all again too, as if that blind rage had washed me clean, rid me of hope for the first time. In that night, alive with signs and stars, I opened myself to the gentle indifference of the world. I opened myself to the gentle indifference of the world, finding it so much like myself, so like a brother, really. I felt that I had been happy, that I was happy again. For everything to be consummated, for me to feel less alone, I had only to wish that there would be a large crowd of spectators the day of my execution, and that they would greet me with cries of hate. Thank you for listening. Peace out, everybody. Don't be a stranger.